Hello, Waits. This is Mr.Westra here with Half Brother 24, Part 2. Have you spent any time with mature chimps? Helson asked us. Briefly, at Borroway when I got Zan, Mum said. Aha, and you? He asked my father. Unfortunately not, said Dad. Well, you're in for an education after dinner. I could tell Dad didn't like being talked to like this. He probably thought he'd had more education than Helson, down here on his ranch in Nowheresville, Nevada. Excellent meal, he said. Thank you so much for your hospitality. Not at all, said Helson. It's been a trying day for you. Now, Sue Ellen and Winston, help your mother clean up while I take the Tomlins out to the colony. The night air was warm. Bugs pulsed over the fields. As we neared the big, ugly concrete building, I could still hear some of the hoots and pants and wails, but it was much quieter than when we'd arrived. We reached the door. Not steel, not like a bank vault or anything. Just normal. Inside we went, Zan still asleep in Mum's arms, though starting to stir. I carried his suitcase. The smell came first. Humid, intense. Nothing as bad as the pig pen I'd visited once on a class trip, but right away you knew you were in the presence of big animals. Helson switched on a single, very dim light. All around the perimeter of the room were big cages, separated but connected to each other with tunnels. I was aware of dark shapes within the cages. An incredible noise suddenly came at us. Hoots and shrieks and barks and cries, rising to a crescendo that hurt my ears. Not too used to visitors after dinner, said Helson. Inside the cages the great shapes stirred. Some stood on two legs. Some pressed their bodies right against the bars, arms raised, and a few of them howled, their vast mouths all teeth and red gums. They were massive. Their faces and hands and fur were much darker than Zan's. They were not beautiful. Zan was just a baby, and I was terrified for him. Peter was beside me, and I felt his hand on my shoulder. It's okay, he whispered in my ear. They just like making noise. They're not so bad. I'll introduce you properly tomorrow. We'll put Zan in here for now, said Helson, leading us to one of the smaller cages in the corner of the building. It's sealed off. A cage. Not a room, but a cage. There was a concrete floor with a drain in the middle. Nothing else. Helson unlocked the door and swung it wide. I looked at Mum, who held Zan swaddled in his favorite blanket. Bring him in, said Helson. He smiled, but sounded impatient. Reluctantly, Mum went inside. I followed her with my little suitcase. The moment I walked through the cage door, I felt queasy. The cage was about 10 by 10. I could see there was a tunnel, but the gate was locked for now. In the next cage over were two big chimps. One sat very still, watching. The other was banging against the bars and hollering. Helson nodded at Zan. Take his clothes off, he told Mum. Why? She asked. Helson chuckled and waved a hand at the next cage. Do you see any of the others wearing clothes? He's grown up in clothes, Mum said, frowning. The other chimps won't accept him, said Helson simply. Take them off. Zan was still asleep, and I helped Mum gently lift his t-shirt over his limp arms. I pulled his shorts down over his legs. That left only the diaper. I undid the clasps and pulled them off. It was warm and damp. Zan looked so much smaller now, so much more vulnerable, and I kept swallowing so I wouldn't cry. I opened Zan's suitcase and started taking out some of his things. No, said Helson, fixing me with those piercing eyes of his. I've been in the middle of spreading Zan's favorite fleecy blankets on the floor. There won't be any of that here. Do you think chimps use blankets in the wild? But Zan wasn't raised in the wild, said Mum. He grew up with blankets and a bed. So I understand, said Helson. But that's not the way my chimps live. We don't pretend they're humans here. They're chimps, and they live like chimps. And there's a lot more dignity in that than dressing them up in children's clothes. The sooner Zan realizes he's a chimp, the better. Now lay him down on the floor. I looked at all the things I'd packed for Zan in his suitcase. His G.I. Joe and his duck and his chimp and his cow. His babies. He loved these things. I looked at Mum, wanting to hear her protest. Mum said, Dr. Helson, surely, for the sake of easing his transition, he can have a couple of his favorite blankets. And his G.I. Joe, I said. He likes that one best. Helson exhaled impatiently. Dad, who was standing outside the cage, nodded. I see no benefit in traumatizing Zan on his first night, he said. The two men looked at each other. One blanket, nothing more, said Helson. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to hurt him. That's his favorite, Mum said to me quietly, nodding at the one I'd already put out. She carefully laid Zan down on it. I folded it over him. Mum headed out of the cage. I closed up the suitcase, and as I stood, I looked at all the people on the other side of the bars. Mum, Dad, Helson, Peter. We can't leave him here, I said. No one replied. I looked at Peter, and all my fury flew towards him. He won't be happy here. You could have told us it would be like this. You saw this place. It's just a zoo. Young man, listen to me, said Helson, and his severe voice made my eyes snap to his. You may not like the look of these cages, but I can assure you, my facilities are as good as it gets in this country. The chimps have large cages, space to play outside, and they have company. They're well fed and have the best vet in the state looking after them. That would be my wife. And they don't have people sticking needles into them and injecting them with hepatitis. I looked down at my shoes, my heart pounding. So much noise in my head. Mum came back inside the cage and leaned her forehead against mine. He's right, Ben. There aren't a lot of places willing to take a chimp, and we tried to find the best one. I really think this is it. Then I'm staying with him tonight, I said. Not in the cage you won't, said Helson. If anything happens to you, I'm liable. Zan would never hurt me, I told him angrily. Helson chuckled. They're full of surprises, especially when under stress. Outside the cage, then, I said. Ben, you're not sleeping outside the cage, said Dad. Mum looked at him. Let him if he wants. The way she said it, the way she looked at Dad, I knew he wouldn't argue. Suit yourself, said Helson. Hard floor. It won't be comfy. No room for service here. And stay away from the other chimp cages. I've got a sleeping bag in the back of my car, Peter told me. I'll get it out for you. After I got settled outside Zan's cage, Mum and Dad said goodbye, and Peter drove them to their motel. I lay there very still. I didn't want to upset the other chimps, most of whom seemed to calm down and had gone to sleep. I did not sleep. I had kept my eyes on Zan, who was starting to stir more and more as the tranquilizer finally wore off. It seemed to take him forever to wake up properly. Or maybe he was awake, and it was just taking him a long time to figure out where on earth he was. Zan, I called out to him softly. I didn't want to get the other chimps going. Eventually, he lifted his head. His eyes met mine. He gave a happy pant hoot and scampered clumsily over, dragging his blanket with him. He settled down in front of me, right against the bars. They didn't seem to freak him out yet. He probably didn't understand what they were. We touched each other through the arms, stroking each other's hair and hands and faces. Wear a shirt, he signed, noticing for the first time he wasn't wearing any clothes. No shirt, I replied. He didn't seem upset. He'd always hated his diaper and getting dressed. Maybe he'd actually be happier naked. He signed Zan Eat. Peter had left me with some food and water, figuring Zan would be hungry if he woke up in the middle of the night. I had several chunks of something that looked like meatloaf, and Zan took them eagerly as I passed them through the bars. If anything, he seemed exciting, like this was all a fun adventure. In, he signed, inviting me inside. No. You in. I shook my head and signed no again. He looked around his cage, this time with more concentration. Out. You me out. Now out. No. Hurry out. I tried to distract him by tickling him through the bars. This seemed to work for a bit. I'd kept his favorite G.I. Joe stuffed in my pocket, and I passed it to him, and he tucked it under his armpit and pulled his blanket around him more. I wished I'd kept more of his toys on me so he could make his protective circle, but Peter had taken the suitcase back to his place. I was worried Zan was getting upset, so I talked to him as I groomed him. I started telling him the story of his day, and of flying on an airplane, but he wouldn't remember any of that. And anyway, it was such a sad story I couldn't keep going. So I made up another story. I told him about how, when the sun came up, we would go out and play, and there would be trees and plants and branches, and we would have lots of tickling and hide and seek. I just kept telling him this over and over, my voice getting slower and sleepier, until his eyelids drooped and we fell asleep together, side by side, touching through the bars.